On July 15th, 1983, 7-year-old Tommy Mitchell was splashing in his family's backyard pool in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. His mother, Linda, could hear his laughter through the kitchen window as she prepared lunch. But when she called him in 20 minutes later, the pool was empty. The gate was still latched. The towels were still folded. Tommy had simply vanished into thin air. For 4 decades, the Mitchell family lived with questions that had no answers. Police searched. Neighbors organized search parties. Private investigators followed dead-end leads across 3 states. But Tommy Mitchell remained a ghost, a missing child poster that faded on telephone poles until the elements finally claimed them too. Then last month, something extraordinary happened. The new owners of the Mitchell property decided to renovate their backyard. What they discovered beneath decades of concrete and carefully maintained landscaping would shatter everything anyone thought they knew about that summer day in 1983. Because Tommy Mitchell didn't just disappear. Someone made sure he stayed close to home. Before we dive into what they found, hit that subscribe button. This story has twists that will keep you watching until the very end, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The Mitchell house at 4127 Saguaro Drive looked like every other home in the Desert Hills subdivision. Single-story ranch style with a red tile roof and a backyard pool surrounded by palm trees and desert landscaping. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on and parents left their doors unlocked. Linda Mitchell had moved there with her husband Robert and their 2 children in the spring of 1982. Tommy was 6 then, full of energy and absolutely fearless when it came to water. His older sister Jennifer was 9 and spent most of her time reading books in the shade, while Tommy turned their pool into his own personal water park. Robert worked construction and was often gone before dawn, returning home dusty and exhausted after long days building shopping centers across the valley. Linda worked part-time at a dental office, but was always home by 3 to meet the school bus. It was a routine that worked for their family. It was safe. It was predictable. Until it wasn't. The morning of July 15th started like any other summer day. Robert left for work at 5:30. Jennifer was spending the week at her grandmother's house in Tucson. Linda made coffee and watched the sunrise paint the mountains pink through her kitchen window. Tommy slept until almost 9, then wandered into the kitchen in his Batman pajamas, asking if he could swim before breakfast. Linda had a rule about swimming: never alone, always wait for an adult to be outside. But it was already hot, and Tommy had been swimming since he was 3 years old. He was like a fish in that pool. Plus, she could see the entire backyard from her kitchen window while she made his favorite chocolate chip pancakes. She said yes. Tommy ran outside in his red swim trunks, the same ones he'd worn every day that summer. Linda watched him cannonball into the deep end, sending water cascading over the pool deck. She smiled and started mixing pancake batter, glancing out the window every few minutes to see Tommy's dark hair breaking the surface as he dove for pool toys. The phone rang at 10:15, Linda's sister calling from California to chat about their mother's upcoming birthday. Linda stretched the cord as far as it would go so she could still see the pool while they talked. Tommy was floating on his back, arms spread wide, staring up at the cloudless sky. The conversation lasted longer than Linda intended. Her sister was going through a divorce and needed to talk. Linda found herself pulled away from the window, sitting at the kitchen table with her back to the yard as she listened and offered comfort. When she finally hung up and called for Tommy to come in for lunch, silence greeted her. Linda stepped outside, expecting to find him hiding behind the pool equipment or maybe napping on one of the lounge chairs. But the backyard was empty. The pool was still. His towel sat folded exactly where he'd left it on the table. She called his name, checked the side yard, ran to the front of the house to see if he'd gone to visit the neighbors. The Hendersons next door hadn't seen him. Neither had the Cartwrights across the street. Mrs. Davidson, the elderly woman who lived behind them, said she'd been gardening all morning and hadn't heard anything unusual. By 11:30, Linda had called the police. Officer David Reese was the first to arrive. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Linda at ease. He walked the perimeter of the yard, checked the pool equipment, examined the gate latch. Everything was secure. Nothing was disturbed. Within an hour, the backyard was full of people, police officers, neighbors, family members who'd rushed over when they heard the news. Everyone had theories. Maybe Tommy had climbed the fence. Maybe he'd wandered into the desert behind the house. Maybe someone had taken him. But none of those theories explained the most puzzling detail of all. Tommy's flip-flops were still sitting beside the pool, perfectly placed, as if he'd just stepped out of them to dive in. His goggles hung on the ladder rail. His favorite pool toy, a rubber shark named Bruce, floated in the shallow end. Everything suggested Tommy had been in that pool moments before Linda stepped outside. But where was he now? Detective Ray Kowalski took over the case that afternoon. He was a 20-year veteran of the Phoenix Police Department with experience in missing children cases. He interviewed Linda twice, asking detailed questions about Tommy's routine, his friends, any strangers who might have been in the neighborhood recently. Robert rushed home from the job site covered in drywall dust and panic. He answered the same questions, provided the same information. Both parents passed polygraph tests. Neither had any reason to harm their son or any motive to make him disappear. The search expanded rapidly. Volunteers combed the desert behind the subdivision. Divers checked every pool, pond, and irrigation canal within a 5-mile radius. Helicopters circled overhead, while tracking dogs followed scent trails that seemed to evaporate at the edge of the Mitchell property. By the third day, FBI agents had joined the investigation. They brought profilers, behavioral analysts, and resources the local police couldn't match. They set up a command post in the Mitchells' living room and turned their quiet suburban home into the center of a federal investigation. Jennifer came home from her grandmother's house to find reporters camped on their front lawn and police cars lining their street. The 9-year-old girl who'd left for a fun week with Grandma returned to a nightmare that would define the rest of her childhood. The media coverage was intense. Tommy's school picture appeared on the evening news every night for weeks. His parents made tearful pleas for information. The story made national headlines when a psychic claimed to have visions of Tommy being held in an underground bunker somewhere in the desert. But as summer turned to fall, the leads dried up. The volunteers stopped coming. The reporters moved on to other stories. The FBI reduced their presence, then closed the case altogether. Tommy Mitchell joined the ranks of America's missing children. Another face on a milk carton. Another family destroyed by questions without answers. The Mitchells never moved. Linda couldn't bear the thought of leaving the last place where Tommy had been alive. What if he came home and they weren't there? What if someone had information and couldn't find them? Robert channeled his grief into maintenance. He painted the pool deck every spring. He trimmed the palm trees. He kept the yard exactly as it had been that July morning, as if preserving the scene might somehow bring their son back. Linda stopped working. She spent her days by the pool, reading missing children reports and following up on tips that came from strangers across the country. She flew to Colorado to investigate a sighting. She drove to Las Vegas when someone called about a boy who looked like Tommy. Every lead was a dead end, but she couldn't stop looking. Jennifer grew up in the shadow of her missing brother. She learned not to complain about anything because her parents' grief was so much greater than any problem she could have. She excelled in school, never caused trouble, and left for college as soon as she could. She loved her parents, but living in that house felt like living in a museum dedicated to tragedy. The years passed slowly. Robert's hair went grey. Linda developed anxiety that kept her awake most nights. They went through the motions of marriage, but the center of their world had vanished with their 7-year-old son. In 1993, 10 years after Tommy's disappearance, they received a call from a detective in California. remains had been found that might match Tommy's description. Robert and Linda flew to Los Angeles with hearts full of hope and dread, only to learn the bones belonged to someone else's child. In 2001, another call, another possible match, another devastating disappointment. The calls became less frequent as technology improved and other cases took priority. By 2010, Linda had accepted what Robert had been telling her for years. Tommy was gone. He wasn't coming home, but she still couldn't bring herself to change his bedroom or remove his pictures from the refrigerator. Robert died of a heart attack in 2018. Linda sold the house 6 months later to a young couple named Brandon and Melissa Torres, who'd fallen in love with the Spanish tile and mature landscaping. They had 2 small children and saw the pool as a perfect place to make family memories. Linda moved to a retirement community across town, but drove by the old house every few weeks. She was relieved to see children playing in the backyard again. It felt like the house was healing, even if she never could. The Torres family lived happily at 4127 Saguaro Drive for 4 years. Brandon worked in tech, Melissa taught elementary school, and their kids Emma and Jake treated the pool like their personal paradise. They had no idea about the tragedy that had occurred there decades earlier. The real estate agent had disclosed the information as required by law, but it felt like ancient history to them. Last spring, Melissa decided she wanted to expand their outdoor living space. She dreamed of adding a pergola, an outdoor kitchen, where they could entertain friends and family. The pool was beautiful, but the concrete deck around it was cracking with age, and some of the decorative stonework was starting to crumble. They hired Southwest Landscape Design to handle the renovation. The crew arrived on March 8, 2024, with jackhammers and excavation equipment. The plan was to remove the old concrete, upgrade the plumbing and electrical systems, then install new decking with integrated lighting and built-in seating areas. Foreman Carlos Mendoza had been doing pool renovations for 15 years. He'd seen everything from cracked foundations to decades-old plumbing disasters, but he'd never seen anything like what they found on the second day of demolition. They were breaking up concrete near the deep end of the pool when Carlos noticed something unusual. The concrete in one section was newer than the rest, poured in a different pattern with a slightly different color. It looked like someone had cut out a section of the original deck and replaced it sometime after the pool was built. When they lifted that section, they found a metal hatch underneath. Carlos stared at the metal hatch for a full minute before calling his crew over. It wasn't on any of the original construction plans. The homeowners had no idea it existed, and judging by the way the concrete had been poured around it, someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. The hatch was maybe 3 feet square, made of heavy steel that had started to rust around the edges. There was no handle, no obvious way to open it. Just a flat metal surface with what looked like bolt holes around the perimeter. Brandon Torres was at work when Carlos called him. The conversation was brief and confusing. "We found something under your pool deck that you need to see," was all Carlos would say. "I think you should call the police." Melissa arrived home first, her heart racing as she pulled into the driveway. The construction crew stood in a tight circle around the excavation site, their faces grim. When she saw the hatch, her first thought was that it might be some kind of old septic system or utility access point. But something about the way it had been concealed bothered her. If it was legitimate infrastructure, why hide it so carefully? Why pour concrete over it in a pattern that didn't match the rest of the deck? Phoenix police officer Janet Walsh arrived 20 minutes later. She was a compact woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen too much in her 20-year career. She took photos of the hatch from every angle and called her supervisor. Within an hour, the backyard was full of people again. Crime scene technicians, detectives, and a representative from the medical examiner's office. The Torres children were sent to stay with neighbors, while investigators tried to figure out what they were dealing with. Detective Lisa Chen had been with Phoenix PD's cold case unit for 8 years. She specialized in missing persons cases that had gone unsolved for decades. When she heard the address, her stomach dropped. She knew exactly which case this might be connected to. Tommy Mitchell's file was thick with reports, witness statements, and photographs that documented every detail of that July day in 1983. Chen had reviewed the case several times over the years, always hoping new technology or a fresh perspective might reveal something previous investigators had missed. But no one had ever thought to look underneath the pool deck. The decision to open the hatch wasn't made lightly. If this was connected to Tommy's disappearance, whatever they found inside could be crucial evidence. But it could also be something completely unrelated, a storm shelter or storage space that had been sealed up for legitimate reasons. Detective Chen called Linda Mitchell, now 78, and living in an assisted living facility across town. The conversation was delicate. Chen explained that new evidence had been discovered at the old house, but she couldn't provide details yet. Linda's voice shook as she asked if they'd found Tommy. "We don't know yet," Chen said gently, "but we're going to find out." The hatch required special tools to open. The bolts had corroded over the decades, and the metal had warped slightly from years of moisture and temperature changes. It took 2 hours and a hydraulic spreader to finally pry it open. Detective Chen was the first to look inside. The space below was roughly 8 feet deep and maybe 6 feet wide. Concrete walls, a concrete floor, and a smell that made everyone step back instinctively. It wasn't the smell of death exactly. It was mustier, older, like air that had been trapped for decades. A ladder was built into one wall, the metal rungs dark with rust. At the bottom, Chen could see what looked like furniture covered with tarps, and something else. Something that made her radio for the medical examiner immediately. Bones. Small bones scattered across the concrete floor. The excavation of the underground space took 3 days. Crime scene technicians worked in shifts, carefully documenting and removing everything they found. The space had clearly been used as some kind of living area. There was a cot with rotted mattress springs, a small table, a bucket in one corner that had obviously been used as a toilet, and toys. Dozens of toys that looked like they were from the early 1980s. Action figures, comic books, a handheld electronic game with a cracked screen, all covered in dust and decay, but recognizable as things a 7-year-old boy might have loved. The bones told a more complicated story than investigators expected. The medical examiner determined they belonged to at least 2 individuals. One set was clearly from a child, aged 6 to 8, who had died sometime in the 1980s. The other remains were from an adult male, probably in his 40s or 50s, who had died more recently. DNA testing would take weeks, but Detective Chen was already building a theory about what had happened in the summer of 1983. Tommy Mitchell hadn't drowned in the pool or been kidnapped by a stranger. He'd been taken by someone who had planned this carefully, someone who had built this underground prison before the boy ever went missing, someone who had watched the Mitchell family, learned their routines, and waited for the perfect opportunity. The hatch had been accessible from the pool area, hidden beneath removable concrete slabs that would have looked like normal decking to anyone who didn't know what to look for. On that July morning, while Linda was on the phone with her sister, someone had grabbed Tommy, forced him down into this space, and sealed him inside. But who? And why had they kept him alive down there instead of killing him immediately? The answers started to emerge when investigators found a journal hidden beneath the rotted mattress. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but most of the writing was still legible. It was written in a careful, precise handwriting that seemed to belong to an educated person. The entries were dated starting in July 1983, just days after Tommy's disappearance. Day 3. The boy has stopped crying constantly. He ate some of the crackers I brought him. I explained that his parents don't want him anymore, that they asked me to take care of him now. He doesn't believe me yet, but he will. Day 8. Tommy asks about his sister every day. I told him Jennifer is in a special school far away and that she might visit someday if he's good. This seems to comfort him. He's starting to trust me. Day 15. We played cards today. He's very smart for his age. I brought him new comic books and a flashlight so he can read when I'm not here. The isolation is working. He depends on me completely now. The journal continued for months. The writer, who never identified himself, documented a systematic process of psychological manipulation designed to make Tommy completely dependent on his captor. He brought food, books, and games. He created elaborate stories about why Tommy couldn't go home. He positioned himself as the boy's only protector in a world that had abandoned him. But as the months passed, the entries became darker. Day 127. Tommy tried to climb out today while I was bringing him dinner. He made it halfway up the ladder before I caught him. I had to punish him. No food for 2 days. He needs to understand that escape is impossible. Day 203. The boy is getting suspicious about my stories. He's old enough to know that what I'm telling him doesn't make sense. I may need to consider other options soon. Day 246. Tommy won't stop asking to see his parents. He says he knows I'm lying about them not wanting him. He's becoming difficult to manage. The neighbors are starting to ask questions about why I'm home so much during the day. The final entries in the journal were dated in early 1984, almost 7 months after Tommy's disappearance. Day 267. I can't do this anymore. The boy knows too much. He's seen my face every day for months. If anyone ever found him, he could identify me immediately. I never planned for this to go on so long. Day 271. It's finished. Tommy won't be asking any more questions. I'll wait until spring to seal this place permanently. By then, everyone will have stopped looking. Detective Chen felt sick as she read those final entries. The careful, clinical tone made it clear that Tommy's captor had killed him not in a moment of rage or panic, but as a calculated decision. The boy had become inconvenient, so he was eliminated. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. Who was this person? How had he known the Mitchell family's routines well enough to plan such a perfect crime? How had he built this underground prison without anyone noticing? And most puzzling of all, whose were the adult bones they'd found in the space? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Mitchell, now 50 and living in Colorado, called Detective Chen after seeing news reports about the discovery. She'd been following the story with a mixture of hope and dread, wondering if her brother's body had finally been found. But Jennifer had information that no one else possessed. Information she'd never shared with police because she'd been too young to understand its significance when Tommy disappeared. There was a man, she told Detective Chen during a phone interview. He worked for the pool company that installed our pool the year before Tommy went missing. He came back several times after the installation was finished, always saying he needed to check something or adjust the equipment. Jennifer remembered the man because he'd always been friendly to her and Tommy, asking about school and their favorite TV shows. He'd seemed genuinely interested in their lives, which had made her feel special. Most adults barely noticed kids. He knew our schedules, Jennifer continued. He knew when Dad left for work and when Mom would be inside making breakfast. He knew I was going to Grandma's house that week. He probably knew exactly when would be the best time to take Tommy. The man's name was Michael Bradshaw. He was 43 in 1983, divorced, and lived alone in a small house about 2 miles from the Mitchell family. He'd worked for Desert Oasis Pool Company for 6 years and had access to dozens of homes throughout the Phoenix area. According to company records, Bradshaw had quit his job in August 1983, just weeks after Tommy's disappearance. He'd told his supervisor he was moving to California to care for a sick relative. No forwarding address had been provided, and he'd never picked up his final paycheck. Detective Chen ran Bradshaw's name through every database she could access. What she found painted a picture of a man who had been spiraling downward for years, before Tommy's abduction. Bradshaw had been arrested twice in the 1970s for loitering near elementary schools. Both charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the pattern was concerning. He'd been fired from a previous job at a summer camp, following complaints from parents about his inappropriate interest in their children. His ex-wife had filed for divorce in 1981, citing irreconcilable differences. But the court records included allegations that Bradshaw had become obsessed with neighbor children, taking photographs of them and following them to school. Everything pointed to Michael Bradshaw as Tommy Mitchell's killer. But if Bradshaw was responsible, why were his bones in the underground chamber alongside Tommy's? The answer came from the final pages of the journal, entries that had been too water-damaged to read initially, but were recovered through careful preservation techniques. Day 1847. 5 years now. I never intended for it to last this long, but I can't stop. There have been others since Tommy, different children from different neighborhoods. None of them lasted as long as he did. Day 109. I'm getting old. My hands shake when I climb down the ladder. The children can see that I'm weak. The current boy tried to attack me yesterday when I brought his food. I had to hit him harder than I meant to. Day 299. I fell coming up the ladder last week, twisted my ankle badly. If something happens to me down here, no one will ever find this place. The children will starve. Maybe that would be better than what I've been doing to them. The final entry was dated December 15th, 1989, more than 6 years after Tommy's disappearance. Day 387. I think I'm having a heart attack. Chest pain for 3 days now. Can't make it up the ladder. The boy is crying because I haven't fed him. If anyone finds this, know that I'm sorry. I never meant for it to become what it became. I just wanted to save them from the world. I thought I could make them happy. Michael Bradshaw had died in the underground chamber he'd created, trapped with his final victim. The boy mentioned in those last entries had presumably starved to death after Bradshaw's heart attack. Their bones had been mixed together for 35 years, predator and prey united in death. But Tommy Mitchell's remains told a different story. His bones showed signs of trauma consistent with blunt force injuries. He'd been killed quickly, probably within the first year of his captivity, just as the journal suggested. The other children Bradshaw mentioned in his later entries remained unidentified. Detective Chen cross-referenced missing children reports from the Phoenix area between 1984 and 1989, looking for cases that might be connected. She found 4 possibilities. Kevin Santos, age 8, who disappeared from a park in 1985. Maria Gonzalez, age 6, who'd vanished from her front yard in 1987. David Kim, age 7, missing from a shopping mall in 1988. And Ryan Murphy, age 9, who'd been abducted from a school playground in 1989. None of these cases had ever been solved. All of the children had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind devastated families and investigators with no leads to follow. Now there was a chance that some of these families might finally get answers. The medical examiner's office worked around the clock to process the remains found in Bradshaw's underground chamber. Dr. Patricia Wells, the chief forensic pathologist, had seen her share of disturbing cases over the years, but the mixture of child and adult bones in that concrete tomb haunted her dreams. The DNA results came back in waves. Tommy Mitchell's identity was confirmed first, bringing closure to a family that had waited 41 years for answers. Linda Mitchell, now confined to a wheelchair but still sharp as ever, wept when Detective Chen delivered the news in person. I always knew he was still close to home, Linda whispered, her weathered hands clutching a faded photograph of her son. I used to sit by that pool and talk to him. I could feel him listening. But Tommy's confirmation was just the beginning. The other child remains found in the chamber belonged to Ryan Murphy, the 9-year-old who'd been taken from his school playground in 1989. Ryan had been Bradshaw's final victim, the boy mentioned in those last desperate journal entries. Ryan's parents, now in their 70s, had never stopped searching. His father, James, had become a volunteer with missing children organizations. His mother, Susan, had turned their son's bedroom into a shrine, keeping his clothes folded in drawers and his baseball trophies polished on shelves. The news that Ryan had been found, that he'd been so close to home all these years, shattered them all over again. But it also brought something they'd never expected to feel: relief. The wondering was over. The hoping and fearing with every phone call was finished. Detective Chen worked with cold case units across Arizona to compare Bradshaw's timeline with other missing children cases. The excavation of his former residence on Maple Street revealed even more evidence of his crimes. Hidden beneath his basement floor, investigators found personal items that belonged to at least 6 different children. A pink hair ribbon that matched the one Maria Gonzalez had been wearing when she vanished from her front yard. A small silver watch engraved with the name Kevin Santos. A pair of glasses with a prescription that matched David Kim's medical records. Each discovery was another family's nightmare finally given form. But the most chilling find was Bradshaw's collection of photographs. Hidden in a waterproof container buried in his backyard were hundreds of pictures of children. Some were taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Others showed kids playing in pools that Bradshaw had installed or serviced. Many of the faces belonged to children who had never gone missing, kids who had unknowingly been stalked by a predator hiding in plain sight. The photographs spanned decades, going back to the 1970s, when Bradshaw first started working in pool construction. They showed his evolution from someone who simply watched children to someone who acted on his obsessions. The pictures from the early years were taken from far away, almost innocent if you didn't know the context. But as time progressed, they became more invasive, more focused, more dangerous. Detective Chen realized they were looking at the documented progression of a serial killer. Bradshaw hadn't started with Tommy Mitchell. He'd been building toward that moment for years, learning from each encounter, refining his methods, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The pool installation at the Mitchell house had been that opportunity. Working there for several days had given Bradshaw intimate knowledge of the family's routines. He'd seen Linda's pattern of staying inside while Tommy swam. He'd observed Robert leaving for work before dawn. He'd even known about Jennifer's planned visit to her grandmother's house because the family had mentioned it casually during his visits. Most importantly, he'd used his legitimate access to the property to build his underground prison. The concrete work required for the hidden chamber would have been easy to disguise as part of the pool installation process. A few extra trips to pour concrete, a few additional materials ordered through the company, and no one would have questioned it. The Desert Oasis Pool Company records from 1982 and 1983 revealed the full scope of Bradshaw's preparation. He'd ordered significantly more concrete and steel than was needed for a standard pool installation. The extra materials had been billed as foundation reinforcement and decorative elements, normal enough that his supervisor never questioned the expenses. But Bradshaw's co-workers remembered him differently now that investigators were asking the right questions. Frank Morrison, who'd worked alongside Bradshaw for 3 years, recalled how obsessive he'd become about the Mitchell job. He kept going back there, Morrison told Detective Chen during an interview. Said he wanted to make sure everything was perfect. We'd finish a job and move on to the next one, but Mike would drive back to houses we'd already completed. Said he was checking for settling or cracks, but it never made sense to me. Morrison also remembered Bradshaw's unusual interest in the families they worked for, especially families with young children. He'd ask a lot of questions about their schedules, when the kids got home from school, whether both parents worked. I thought he was just being friendly, making conversation. Now I realize he was gathering information. The investigation expanded to include every pool installation Bradshaw had worked on during his 6 years with the company. Investigators contacted hundreds of families, asking if they remembered anything unusual about his behavior or if their children had ever mentioned uncomfortable interactions with him. Most of the responses were negative, but several families reported incidents that seemed minor at the time, but took on sinister meaning in hindsight. Children who said the pool man had asked them personal questions about their friends and family. Parents who remembered Bradshaw lingering after work was finished, claiming to double-check his installations. 2 families reported that their children had complained about feeling watched while swimming. In both cases, the parents had dismissed these concerns as childhood imagination. Now they wondered if Bradshaw had been returning to observe his potential victims. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a methodical predator who had used his job as the perfect cover for his crimes. Pool installers had legitimate reasons to visit affluent suburban neighborhoods where children played freely. They worked around water, which naturally attracted kids who wanted to see the construction process, and they had access to backyards and private spaces where they could observe family routines without suspicion. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case, explained Bradshaw's progression from voyeur to killer. He started by satisfying his urges through observation and photography, but like many serial offenders, those behaviors eventually weren't enough. He needed more control, more access, more power over his victims. The underground chamber represented the ultimate expression of that need for control. Bradshaw had created a space where he could keep children completely isolated from the outside world, where he was their only source of food, comfort, and human contact. The journal entries show classic signs of someone who believed he was saving these children from something, Dr. Foster continued. He'd convinced himself that he was protecting them, that their families didn't truly love them. It's a common delusion among this type of offender. They create elaborate justifications for their actions. But the journal also revealed something investigators hadn't expected: genuine remorse. Bradshaw's later entries showed increasing awareness that his actions were destroying innocent lives. He wrote about nightmares, about the faces of children who died in his care, about his growing desperation to stop, but inability to control his urges. Day 2, 156. I dream about them every night now. Tommy still asks for his mother. The others cry for families I told them had abandoned them. I know I'm the monster in this story, but I can't stop. Something is broken inside me and I don't know how to fix it. Detective Chen found these expressions of guilt particularly disturbing. They suggested that Bradshaw had been fully aware of the suffering he was causing, but had been unable or unwilling to seek help. Instead, he'd continued taking children, adding to his collection of victims, feeding an addiction he knew was destroying both them and himself. The investigation also revealed how close authorities had come to discovering Bradshaw's crimes while they were still happening. In 1987, a neighbor named Betty Williams had called police to report suspicious activity at Bradshaw's house. I heard children crying at night, Williams told investigators in 1987. Not playing sounds, but real crying, like someone was hurt. When I asked Mike about it, he said he was watching his nephew sometimes, but I never saw any kids in his yard during the day. Police had responded to Williams's complaint by conducting a brief interview with Bradshaw at his front door. He'd been polite and cooperative, explaining that he occasionally babysat for his ex-wife's sister. The officer had noted that Bradshaw seemed nervous, but attributed it to normal anxiety about having police at his door. No search warrant had been requested. No follow-up investigation had been conducted. If authorities had looked more closely, they might have discovered the underground chamber and saved Ryan Murphy's life. Williams, now 82 and living in a nursing home, broke down when Detective Chen told her what investigators had found. "I should have pushed harder," she sobbed. "I knew something wasn't right. Those poor babies were right there, and nobody listened to me." The case files from 1987 showed a pattern that had become all too familiar to modern investigators. Complaints about suspicious behavior involving children were often dismissed or handled with minimal investigation. The benefit of the doubt was given to adult men who seemed respectable on the surface, while the concerns of neighbors and even children themselves were treated as overreactions. Detective Chen wondered how many other cases from that era might have been solved if authorities had taken such reports more seriously. How many children might still be alive if investigators had been more willing to obtain search warrants based on circumstantial evidence? The forensic work at Bradshaw's former residence continued for weeks. Ground-penetrating radar revealed several areas of disturbed soil in his backyard, leading to additional excavations. Most of these sites yielded only construction debris and household trash, but one contained something that changed the entire scope of the investigation. Buried 3 feet beneath Bradshaw's garden shed, investigators found a metal box containing hundreds of documents: driver's licenses, social security cards, birth certificates, and school records belonging to children from across the southwestern United States. Some of the names matched missing persons cases from Arizona, but others corresponded to disappearances in Nevada, California, and New Mexico. The documents suggested that Bradshaw's crimes had extended far beyond the Phoenix area. After leaving his job at Desert Oasis Pool Company, he'd apparently continued taking children while moving from state to state. The latest documents in the collection were dated 1988, just 1 year before his apparent death in the underground chamber. Detective Chen contacted law enforcement agencies in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Albuquerque to share information about Bradshaw's possible activities in their jurisdictions. Several cold cases immediately emerged as potential matches. In Las Vegas, 8-year-old Ashley Martinez had vanished from a community pool in 1985. Witnesses had seen her talking to a man who claimed to be checking the pool equipment, but no one had gotten a clear description of his face. In Los Angeles, twin brothers Carlos and Miguel Herrera, both aged 7, had disappeared from their apartment complex pool in 1986. Their mother had been inside their unit for less than 10 minutes, but when she returned, the boys were gone. In Albuquerque, 6-year-old Jennifer Walsh had been taken from a public pool during a family reunion in 1987. Her parents had assumed she was with cousins. Her cousins thought she was with her parents. By the time anyone realized she was missing, hours had passed. All of these cases involved children who had been near swimming pools when they disappeared. All remained unsolved, and all had occurred during time periods when Bradshaw could have been in those cities. The multi-state investigation that followed would eventually identify Michael Bradshaw as one of the most prolific child killers in American history. But for the families in Phoenix, who had waited decades for answers, the most important discovery was much simpler. Their children had been found. Linda Mitchell died peacefully in her sleep 2 months after Tommy's remains were recovered. Her obituary mentioned that she was preceded in death by her beloved son, finally reunited after 41 years of separation. At her funeral, Jennifer spoke about her mother's unwavering faith that Tommy would someday come home. She never stopped believing, Jennifer said through tears. Even when everyone else gave up hope, Mom knew he was out there somewhere. She was right. He was waiting for us to find him. The investigation into Michael Bradshaw's crimes would continue for years as authorities worked to identify all of his victims and provide closure to families across multiple states. But in that quiet backyard on Saguaro Drive, where a little boy had vanished on a summer morning in 1983, there was finally peace. The Torres family moved out of the house before the investigation was complete. They couldn't bear to live in a place where such horrors had occurred, couldn't let their children swim in a pool that had been built over a tomb. The property was eventually purchased by the city and converted into a memorial garden dedicated to missing children. A bronze plaque near the entrance bears the names of Tommy Mitchell, Ryan Murphy, and the other victims whose remains were identified through Bradshaw's collection of documents. Visitors often leave flowers there, small toys, and photographs of their own missing loved ones. The memorial serves as both a tribute to lives lost and a reminder of the evil that can hide behind ordinary facades. Michael Bradshaw had been a neighbor, a co-worker, a man who seemed unremarkable to those around him. His crimes had gone undetected for years because no one had imagined that such darkness could exist so close to home. But the discovery of that hidden hatch had changed everything. It had brought justice to families who thought they would never find peace. It had solved cases that investigators thought were unsolvable. And it had ensured that the children who died in that underground chamber would finally be remembered not as missing person statistics, but as beloved sons and daughters who had been taken too soon. The horror beneath the pool deck was over. The truth, terrible as it was, had finally come to light. The ripple effects of the Bradshaw case reached far beyond Phoenix. In FBI headquarters in Quantico, behavioral analysts were studying his methods, trying to understand how he'd evaded detection for so long. The case had exposed critical gaps in how missing children investigations were conducted in the 1980s, when communication between jurisdictions was limited and databases were primitive. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, no relation to the family who'd discovered the hatch, had been tracking patterns in cold cases involving missing children for over a decade. When she saw the Bradshaw files, she immediately recognized similarities to cases she'd been investigating across the country. "This isn't just about one predator," she told her team during a briefing at the Phoenix field office. "This is about a system that failed these children repeatedly. We had the tools to catch him, but we didn't connect the dots." The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit launched a comprehensive review of unsolved child abduction cases from 1975 to 1990, looking for patterns that might indicate other predators using similar methods. What they found was disturbing. At least 12 other cases showed signs of being connected to individuals who used legitimate employment as cover for stalking potential victims. Pool maintenance workers, cable installers, utility repair technicians, landscapers, all had access to homes and families in ways that allowed them to study routines and identify vulnerable children. The Bradshaw case had revealed a predatory strategy that was likely being used by others who remained unidentified. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, Detective Chen was dealing with the overwhelming response from families of missing children. Her phone rang constantly with calls from parents who wondered if their cases might be connected to Bradshaw. Each conversation was heartbreaking, filled with desperate hope that decades of uncertainty might finally end. One call stood out among the rest. Patricia Hoffman contacted Chen from Portland, Oregon, about her daughter Michelle, who had disappeared in 1984. The family had been visiting Phoenix during spring break, staying at a hotel with a pool. 9-year-old Michelle had been swimming when she vanished, but unlike Tommy Mitchell, her disappearance had happened in broad daylight, with dozens of witnesses around. "Nobody saw anything," Patricia explained, her voice still raw with pain after 40 years. "One minute she was in the shallow end with other kids, the next minute she was gone. The hotel staff searched everywhere. The police interviewed everyone, but it was like she just evaporated." Chen pulled the case file from 1984. The investigating officers had done everything right, following proper procedures and interviewing hundreds of potential witnesses. But they'd been looking for a stranger, someone who didn't belong at the hotel. They'd never considered that the perpetrator might have had a legitimate reason to be there. Chen cross-referenced the hotel's maintenance records from that week. Desert Oasis Pool Company had serviced the pool system on March 15, 1984, just 2 days before Michelle's disappearance. The work order was signed by Michael Bradshaw. Patricia Hoffman broke down when Chen called her back with the information. After 4 decades of wondering, she finally had an answer. Michelle's personal items weren't found among Bradshaw's collection, suggesting she might have been killed immediately, rather than kept alive like his other victims. In some ways, Patricia said, that was a mercy. The Hoffman case opened another line of investigation. If Bradshaw had been targeting children at hotels and resorts, there might be other victims who had never been connected to him because their disappearances occurred far from his home base. Chen began contacting police departments in tourist destinations throughout Arizona, looking for similar cases from the 1980s. She found them. In Sedona, a 7-year-old boy named Christopher Lane had vanished from a resort pool in 1985. In Flagstaff, Twin girls named Emma and Sophie Carter had disappeared during a family camping trip near a lake in 1986. In Tucson, 5-year-old Marcus Webb had gone missing from a water park in 1987. All of these cases had been investigated as isolated incidents. The children were from out of state, their families had no connection to Arizona beyond their vacations, and there were no obvious suspects. But when Chen mapped the locations and dates, a pattern emerged that centered around places where Bradshaw's company had contracts for maintenance and repairs. The scope of Bradshaw's crimes was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested he had been responsible for at least 20 child abductions over a 15-year period. Most of his victims had never been found, their remains likely scattered across the desert or buried in locations that would never be discovered. Dr. Harrison Blake, a criminologist at Arizona State University, was brought in to analyze Bradshaw's behavioral patterns. His preliminary report painted a picture of a highly organized killer who had learned from each crime and refined his methods over time. Bradshaw represents the most dangerous type of predator, Dr. Blake explained to a gathering of law enforcement officials. He was intelligent, patient, and able to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing horrific crimes. His use of legitimate employment as cover was brilliant in its simplicity. Blake's analysis revealed how Bradshaw had evolved from an opportunistic offender to a sophisticated predator. His early crimes had been impulsive, taking advantage of situations that presented themselves during his work. But as time went on, he'd begun creating opportunities, deliberately seeking out jobs that would give him access to potential victims. The underground chamber at the Mitchell house represented the pinnacle of his criminal evolution. It was a permanent installation that allowed him to keep victims for extended periods while maintaining his normal life above ground. The careful construction and concealment showed months of planning and preparation. But the chamber had also been Bradshaw's downfall. His need to return repeatedly to the Mitchell property had eventually trapped him there. When his health failed, he'd been unable to escape the prison he'd created, dying alongside his final victim in the darkness below. The psychological autopsy of Bradshaw's final years revealed a man consumed by his own compulsions. Co-workers from his various jobs after leaving Desert Oasis described someone who had become increasingly paranoid and isolated. He'd moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form relationships or attract attention from neighbors. Financial records showed that Bradshaw had been living on cash for most of the 1980s, avoiding banks and credit cards that might create paper trails. He'd worked under assumed names for several employers, using false identification documents that investigators suspected he'd obtained through his victims. The revelation that Bradshaw had been using his victims' identities added another layer of horror to his crimes. Parents who had spent decades hoping their children might someday return home had to confront the possibility that their sons and daughters had been erased, not just physically, but legally as well. Nancy Rodriguez received one of the most difficult phone calls of the investigation. Her son Daniel had disappeared from a Phoenix park in 1983, just weeks after Tommy Mitchell. For years, she'd held on to the hope that he might be alive somewhere, maybe suffering from amnesia, or being held by someone who treated him kindly. Detective Chen had to tell her that Daniel's birth certificate and social security card had been found among Bradshaw's documents, but his remains had not been recovered. The implication was clear. Bradshaw had killed Daniel and assumed his identity for some period of time. "My baby became a ghost twice," Nancy sobbed during the phone call. First when he was taken, and then when that monster stole his name. The identity theft aspect of Bradshaw's crimes prompted a review of thousands of documents from the Social Security Administration and Department of Motor Vehicles. Investigators found evidence that at least 8 of Bradshaw's victims had been used to create false identities that he'd maintained for years after their deaths. This discovery led to the resolution of several financial crimes from the 1980s. Bank accounts opened under children's names, credit cards issued to minors, Even a mortgage application filed by someone claiming to be a 16-year-old who had inherited property from deceased parents. All of these transactions could now be traced back to Bradshaw's systematic exploitation of his victims' identities. The full scope of his crimes might never be known. Investigators estimated that Bradshaw's document collection represented only a fraction of his victims, suggesting that many more children had been taken and killed without leaving any trace in his records. These children remained missing, their families still waiting for answers that might never come. As the investigation wound down, Detective Chen reflected on the case that had consumed her life for the better part of a year. The discovery of the hidden chamber had brought closure to some families, but it had also opened wounds that might never heal. Knowing what had happened to their children was both a blessing and a curse for parents who had spent decades imagining scenarios that were often less horrific than the truth. The Bradshaw case had changed how missing children investigations were conducted. New protocols required better communication between jurisdictions, more thorough background checks for individuals with access to children, and enhanced databases that could identify patterns across multiple cases. But for Chen, the most important outcome was simpler. Tommy Mitchell was going home. After 41 years, Linda Mitchell's son would finally be laid to rest beside his father in the cemetery, where his mother had always believed he would someday join them. The funeral was held on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after the discovery of the hidden chamber. Jennifer Mitchell, now a grandmother herself, stood beside her brother's small casket as hundreds of people gathered to honor a child they had never met but would never forget. Among the mourners were families of other victims, investigators who had worked the case, and neighbors who remembered that terrible summer day in 1983. They came to pay their respects to Tommy, but also to acknowledge the other children whose stories would never have such closure. Father Michael O'Brien, who had officiated at Linda Mitchell's funeral, spoke about the mystery of suffering and the power of truth to bring healing even in the darkest circumstances. He reminded the gathering that Tommy's death had not been meaningless if it led to justice for others and prevented future tragedies. "We cannot undo the evil that was done," Father O'Brien said, "but we can ensure that these children are remembered, that their lives mattered, and that their deaths were not in vain." As Tommy's casket was lowered into the ground, Jennifer placed a small toy shark on top, the same kind of pool toy that had floated in their backyard pool on the day he disappeared. It was her way of giving him back the childhood that had been stolen, of letting him play one more time in the water he had loved so much. The investigation officially closed 6 months later, though individual cases connected to Bradshaw would continue to be resolved for years to come. The final report ran over 3,000 pages and detailed the systematic failures that had allowed one man to terrorize families across multiple states for more than a decade. But buried within those pages of official language and forensic analysis was a simpler truth. Evil had been defeated by persistence, science, and the refusal of people like Detective Chen to give up on children who had been forgotten by everyone else. The memorial garden at 4127 Saguaro Drive was dedicated on the 5th anniversary of the discovery. The bronze plaque bore the names of all known victims, but space had been left for others who might someday be identified. The garden featured a small pool with a fountain, surrounded by flowers that bloomed year-round in the Arizona sun. Children played there now, their laughter echoing across the space where Tommy Mitchell had once splashed happily in his family's backyard pool. It was exactly what Linda Mitchell would have wanted, a place where the innocence that had been destroyed could somehow be restored, where the darkness that had consumed her son could be replaced with light and life. The case had shown that monsters were real, that they could hide among us for years without detection. But it had also shown that truth was more powerful than deception, that love was stronger than evil, and that even after decades of darkness, justice could still find its way to the surface. In the end, Tommy Mitchell had come home. Not as his mother had dreamed, running through the front door with wet hair and chlorine-scented skin, but as a memory preserved in stone and flowers, a name that would never be forgotten, a child whose death had meaning because it led to the salvation of others. The boy who had vanished from a backyard pool in 1983 had finally found peace, and in finding him, investigators had ensured that Michael Bradshaw's reign of terror was truly over. His victims remembered not as statistics in a file, but as beloved children who had been taken too soon, but were now, at last, home. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement. Child psychologists across the country began studying the Bradshaw case to understand how victims of prolonged captivity survived psychologically. Dr. Rachel Winters from the University of Colorado published a groundbreaking paper on childhood resilience based on the journal entries found in the underground chamber. What's remarkable about Tommy's case is how he maintained his sense of identity despite months of psychological manipulation, Dr. Winters explained during a conference on missing children. Bradshaw's journal shows that Tommy never stopped asking for his parents, never fully accepted the lies he was told. That resistance, even at age 7, speaks to an incredible strength of spirit. The study led to new therapeutic approaches for children who had survived abduction or abuse. The Tommy Mitchell Foundation, established by Jennifer Mitchell Reynolds using her maiden name, funded research into trauma recovery and provided resources for families dealing with missing children cases. But not everyone was satisfied with the official conclusion of the investigation. Eleanor Vasquez, a retired Phoenix police dispatcher who had worked during the 1980s, came forward with information that had been buried in departmental records for decades. In 1984, just months after Tommy's disappearance, Vasquez had received a strange phone call at the police station. The caller, a woman who refused to give her name, claimed she had information about the missing Mitchell boy. She said she'd seen a child matching Tommy's description at a house on Maple Street, but the call had been disconnected before she could provide more details. I tried to trace the call, but this was before caller ID, Vasquez told Detective Chen during a recorded interview. I filed a report, but with no name and no specific address, there wasn't much to follow up on. Now I realized she was probably talking about Bradshaw's house. The revelation that someone had potentially known about Tommy's location while he was still alive haunted investigators. If the anonymous caller had been more specific, if the report had been taken more seriously, if someone had canvassed every house on Maple Street, Tommy might have been rescued. Chen requested the original dispatch logs from 1984, hoping to find more details about the mysterious phone call. What she discovered was even more disturbing than she'd expected. There had been 7 similar calls between 1983 and 1989, all reporting sightings of missing children in the Phoenix area. Most of the calls had been dismissed as crank calls or mistaken identity. But when Chen mapped the locations mentioned in these reports, they formed a rough circle around known addresses where Bradshaw had lived or worked during those years. Someone knew, Chen told FBI agent Torres during one of their weekly briefings. Maybe multiple people knew what was happening, but they were either too scared to come forward or nobody took them seriously. The possibility that Bradshaw had accomplices or that witnesses had been ignored added another layer of tragedy to the case. It also raised questions about other missing children cases from that era. How many other anonymous tips had been disregarded? How many children might have been saved if investigators had been more aggressive in following up on seemingly minor leads? Agent Torres decided to expand the FBI's review beyond just cases potentially connected to Bradshaw. She launched Operation Second Chance, a comprehensive examination of all unsolved child abduction cases from 1980 to 1995, where anonymous tips or unusual circumstances had been reported but not thoroughly investigated. The operation uncovered disturbing patterns in multiple cities across the American Southwest. In Albuquerque, 3 separate callers had reported seeing children who matched descriptions of missing kids, but none of the reports had resulted in searches or arrests. In Las Vegas, a hotel employee had called police about suspicious behavior involving children at a resort pool, but the complaint had been filed away without follow-up. Operation Second Chance led to the reopening of 47 cold cases and the identification of 6 additional serial predators who had operated during the same time period as Bradshaw. 2 of these individuals were still alive and were arrested based on evidence uncovered during the expanded investigation. But perhaps the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychologist who had profiled Bradshaw, received a letter from a woman named Catherine Mills, who had been following news coverage of the case. Mills, now 68 and living in retirement in Florida, had worked as a secretary for Desert Oasis Pool Company from 1979 to 1985. She had been one of the few employees who had regular contact with Bradshaw during his years with the company, handling his work orders and scheduling his appointments. "I always thought there was something off about Mike," Mills wrote in her letter to Dr. Foster. "He was polite enough, but he had this way of asking questions about the families we worked for that made me uncomfortable. He wanted to know about their children, their schedules, whether they had security systems or dogs." Mills had kept detailed records of her interactions with company employees, including notes about their behavior and performance. Her files on Bradshaw painted a picture of someone who had been systematically gathering intelligence on potential victims for years before he acted on his impulses. The records showed that Bradshaw had specifically requested assignments to homes with young children, often volunteering to take jobs that other installers considered difficult or time-consuming. He had also frequently returned to completed installations under the pretense of warranty work or follow-up inspections. "I mentioned my concerns to the owner a few times," Mills continued in her letter, "but Mike was one of our most reliable workers. He never missed shifts, never complained about difficult customers, and his work was always perfect. Mr. Davidson said I was being paranoid." 41 years after a 7-year-old boy vanished from his backyard pool, the truth finally surfaced from beneath concrete and lies. Tommy Mitchell's story reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces, but persistence and justice never truly die. Sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we ever imagined, waiting in the darkness until someone brave enough decides to dig deeper. If this story stayed with you, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it.